This is the Dell Vostro 3550, a business class laptop from 2012. I like to call this the Latitude E6420 at home because it's basically just a lower end version of the E6420. Just a small note while I'm editing this, I'm only 15 seconds into this audio and I already noticed a bit of a problem. You might notice that I've compared it to my Latitude E6420, the 14-inch laptop, while I really should be comparing it to the E6520 15-inch version. I've only done a video on my E6420, I don't have a 6520, so I was trying to compare it to the thing I've already done a video on, but I realized that that probably doesn't make a lot of sense. This is probably why the thumbnail text is going to be different from what I'm actually comparing it to in the video, but just note that I was trying to compare it to the thing I've already done a video on. Look, I recorded most of this audio at 2 AM. My brain was asleep. Sorry. This computer was sold around the same time as the E6420, and it has pretty much the same hardware, it's just lower end. This particular one was around $600 at launch from what I can find, but they could have been a lot higher end. This one only had a Core i3-2330M with 3 gigs of RAM, a 320 gig 7200 RPM hard drive, an 8x DVD drive, Intel wireless, as well as integrated graphics, a 1366x768 display, and Windows 7 Professional. This also appears to be a reworked version of the Inspiron 15R, also from around the same time. It's a similar chassis from what I can find, and a lot of the parts are the same. This one is finished in what they call Aberdeen Silver. It was apparently also offered in bronze and red. This could have been configured with up to an i7 processor and AMD Radeon graphics, but no such luck with this one. However, I did upgrade it to a Core i5-2520M CPU, added another gig of RAM to bring it up to 4, and since I didn't get the original hard drive, basically downgraded it with a 500GB 5400 RPM drive. So it's still fairly average, but it's better than where it was before. Externally, on the front of the computer, there are 4 status LEDs for power, hard drive, battery charge, and Wi-Fi status. On the right side of the laptop, there's a mini express card slot, the DVD-RW drive, headphone and microphone jacks, a USB 3.0 port, which is actually something that is not present on the E6420. On the back, we have the Kensington lock slot, Gigabit Ethernet, another USB 3.0 port, the VGA port without the screws, and the DC in-jack, which is identical to the one used on the Latitudes. On the left side, we have a USB 2.0 port, the cooling vent, an HDMI port, an eSATA USB combo port, and an SD card slot. It's probably worth pointing out that this one appears to have been dropped at some point in its life, since all of the plastic is all cracked in one corner and the metal is bowed outwards, so using the SD card slot, for example, is a little bit awkward. But it's purely cosmetic and hasn't actually caused any damage to the system. The lid is brushed aluminum with some plastic trim pieces, but as this is a more budget PC, its build quality isn't nearly as good as the Latitudes, and it doesn't take much to dent or scratch the lid as shown here. This one appears to be missing the trim piece that goes behind the display, which appears to be fairly common since a lot of the ones on like eBay, for example, don't have this piece either. The hinges on this example are still fairly good after all this time, and this computer can be opened with one hand. The palm rest is plastic as opposed to the soft touch rubber thing that they did on the E6420, but I actually prefer this one because it means it's aged a lot better than any of those Latitude palm rests. Up top we have the power button, and instead of dedicated volume controls, you get some Dell shortcut buttons instead. Below that we have the keyboard, which is fairly well loved. It's very worn. It's also a newer chiclet style keyboard, which was starting to become a thing around this time. It has some secondary functions as well as a dedicated mute key, and overall typing on it is actually fairly good. Unfortunately, while I was using this computer for the Windows 9 edition video, the keyboard kind of broke, so it still works, but some of the keys, like the spacebar and backspace and enter keys, don't work, meaning that any text on this computer is going to look like this. Which is truly a shame, because other than some flex from where the keyboard just won't snap back into place, honestly, it's really not a bad keyboard to type on. And it's fairly tactile, and it feels good to type on, but unfortunately, it doesn't work. Below that, we have some Vostro branding, which has since worn off over time, as well as the fairly large trackpad with clicky buttons. I don't really have any complaints about this, actually. It's a fairly good touchpad. There's also a dedicated LED for when the touchpad is disabled. There's the Intel and Windows 7 stickers towards the bottom, and lastly, this computer has a fingerprint reader, which is nice. As mentioned previously, this has a 15.6-inch 1366 by 768 display, which is a matte display, and that's about all the positives because it's a TN panel and it has absolutely garbage viewing angles, as you would expect for one of those. There's also a webcam and stereo microphone on this. On the bottom, the system is missing its battery, though since it is basically a rebadged Inspiron 15R, it's not the end of the world to find a replacement. I just haven't because I'm lazy. And we have the single compartment door for, well, not actually a lot. There is an empty space where there could have been a slot, presumably either for an mSATA drive or more realistically a mobile broadband device. The RAM, which again I upgraded to 4 gigs, one of these sticks is still original, the other is not. And the hard drive, which, probably to save money, is mounted in with just these rails instead of a full caddy. Not that it matters, but if you're curious, this is a Toshiba 500 gig heap of junk, but it's what I have. Under here you can also push out the optical drive. I haven't screwed it in because reasons. This computer's optical drive was manufactured by Matsushita, which I believe is Panasonic, with a fairly thick bezel on it. It's kind of nuts. Unfortunately, to get to the CPU and heatsink, you have to take the entire computer apart. A bit annoying since it's right there, you can see it, but you can't actually get to it. You also have to take this apart to get to the wireless card. It's not accessible from the bottom either. There is the cooling vent with a fairly cool looking pattern. All of the rubber feet that are still somehow here after all this time. The stereo speakers, the Windows 7 product key, and the service tag and other information. Fan noise is pretty good on this one. Even while it's working hard, you can barely hear the cooling fan over the computer sitting directly next to my microphone because I'm a professional at recording. The BIOS on this computer is also a more basic Aptio thing from American Megatrends instead of Dell's usual BIOS. But it does the trick, I guess. There's a couple interesting things in here, such as USB power share, Dell's adapter warnings, as well as the function key behavior, the ability to enable CompuTrace, which thankfully is turned off on this one, and well, actually, that's pretty much about it. It's fairly basic. Also worth pointing out, this is revision A09, which matters because with this BIOS, I actually can't install anything newer than Windows 8 on this computer if I wanted to run Windows, that is. Windows 10 and 11 have a problem with this computer's BIOS, meaning that with this revision, if I attempt to install it, the built-in display won't work. Updating the BIOS apparently fixes this, but you can't do that unless you have a battery. Guess what I don't have? So this is running Windows 7. And a fairly vanilla installation at that, because I don't have any recovery media or anything for this. I didn't get the original drive, of course, and even after all this time, I only found one drivers and utilities disk, which is just mostly drivers. So yeah, it was basically up to whatever I could come up with, which isn't really a lot. Somehow, this might be one of the first computers I've actually struggled to figure out what to run on it. So let's run a benchmark on it. I decided to run a couple versions of Cinebench on this just to see what would happen, specifically R10, R11, and R15 because that's just what I have. It's a bit of fun even though its scores are basically meaningless since I don't expect them to be very good. I also figured it would be appropriate to run this benchmark on my E6420 so that there's something to compare it to. It didn't work very well on this computer. In fact, all of the scores it put out were completely frickin' awful, which could be determined by the fact that the CPU was barely reaching 7.5 watts of power used. This is probably because when I started filming, I used an HP power supply instead of a Dell power supply. I didn't think it made a difference on this Vostro, but it turns out it does. If it doesn't know what the power adapter is, then it limits the power for reasons. Actually, it's kind of reasonable, but it's fairly annoying since it's the only power supply I have at this bench. So to give it a fair shot, I went and grabbed a Dell power supply. One that is way overkill for this computer. And yeah, temperatures and power started to look a lot more reasonable for this hardware. Of course, this is still going to be worse than my E6420 because my E6420 has a better CPU and GPU, but the trade-off is that computer runs a lot hotter when running the same benchmarks than this does. But overall performance is still fine. Of course, it helps that I upgraded the CPU, and if you were to run a more modern operating system, like Linux, or if I could get Windows 10 working, it probably would benefit from more RAM, and obviously an SSD, but even in this configuration, it does work fine, even with 1080p 60 YouTube. So that's fairly good. What isn't fairly good is that display, because as I mentioned earlier, it sucks. Its viewing angles from pretty much any direction are just terrible. And the speakers are a bit of a mixed bag, because they get fairly loud and they sound okay, except the clarity. It's frickin' awful. It sounds like there's something in between the speakers which makes them sound all muffled. Now, I'm not a genius, so this is purely just a guess. But I'd imagine that having tiny openings and being effectively placed on the bottom of the computer probably doesn't help this at all. And there's something else which I don't know if it's actually picked up very well on the recording at all, but it's definitely something that I noticed while filming this segment, is that these speakers have a weird problem with them where the volume fluctuates. Almost as if it's struggling to get constant power or something. It means that the actual volume level isn't consistent, and sometimes it will get very quiet and sometimes it will get very loud. And either way, they're horribly blown, so this probably would just benefit from having the speakers replaced, assuming it isn't caused by some really crappy audio drivers or perhaps a problem with the actual audio chip on this board, since I've had issues with headphones before on this too. Also on the topic of internet stuff, the wireless card in this computer is also a bit of a mixed bag. It likes to drop the connection a lot of the times, and sometimes it's really good, and other times it's really awful. Still probably better than a Broadcom one though. In terms of other features of this computer, the DVD-RW drive, while it's not fast, does get to the speeds it is supposed to, with fairly little issue. This is around the time when optical drives kind of peaked and haven't really improved, so if it wasn't a thicker drive than the more modern slim drives, this could probably still be used in a modern computer with no problems at all. And even while seeking, it's fairly quiet, at least it's kind of like pleasant to the ears. This thing could have apparently been equipped with a Blu-ray drive, which would have been awesome. And it also could have been equipped with an SSD, but this didn't have that. Again, it's down to whatever piece of crap I have laying around. While putting this video together, I did find some utilities on Dell's website for a couple features of the PC, like the quickset software for the function keys, display brightness, and volume control have these little overlays that definitely don't look like macOS at all. One of those shortcut buttons from earlier opens the Windows Mobility Center, which with all of the Dell stuff installed has some extra options for things like Bluetooth and function key and touchpad, and also these settings for the instant launch key, which I didn't know existed until I installed this. That middle button doesn't work though. It's probably for some piece of Dell software, but I don't know what it does. And last but not least, the fingerprint reader, which I've gotten working before, but I couldn't actually get working for this video. With some certain drivers from Dell, it did find it, but in Windows 7 at least, it needed a management application to work, which Dell didn't provide on the website. Using that aforementioned utilities disk, I was able to install this Dell Embassy piece of software that's supposed to work with the fingerprint reader, but I tried that and it also didn't work at all. It doesn't seem to know how to communicate with it. So ending on that disappointing note, that was the Dell Vostro 3550. It is a fairly good laptop and one with a lot of potential. There's very few issues with it other than cosmetic problems with this specific computer. It seems like it was used fairly hard in its past life. It does have some nice features that the Latitude E6420 doesn't have, like USB 3, and arguably could have had better hardware than what you could have found in any of the 20 series Latitudes from this time. They also don't appear to be too hard to find. In fact, when I bought this computer during the pandemic, it actually wasn't even my first choice. The first two I found had already sold before I found this one. So between that and it already having similar models from other product lines, finding spare parts doesn't seem to be too big of a deal. I'm just lazy.